لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وصحبه أجمعين. وبعد. First I want to express my gratitude and happiness to be back here in Seekers Hub. I think the last time was in the summer, in Ramadan. And in addition to the things that she mentioned, I also teach some classes here on the Seekers Hub portal in jurisprudence and fiqh, and now we have a new class in hadith that I think will be offered this term as well. So, as I mentioned, for those of you who are either tuned in last night or physically present, when Shaykh Faraz approached me about having a particular topic for this weekend, I thought a lot about what people are thinking about and what seems to be coming up on everybody's news feeds, if you will. And I think social justice is it's important, it's relevant, and I think also it has gone on too long for, I think, people not really addressing it from a perspective of something that's grounded within what we hope to be our own set of Islamic principles. So what this few hours we're going to spend together is not going to do, I am not here to tell social justice activists how to go about doing that. They're on the ground, they're in the field, they are going to be ultimately much more acquainted with all of that than me. I'm not here to judge them. But what I would like to do is start a conversation, perhaps, and talk about, well, if we're Muslim, and we also believe that any just cause is also, by definition, an Islamic cause, in the sense that anything that is going to affect humanity, right? It doesn't have to be a so-called Islamic thing. It doesn't have to be about serving halal food at your university campus dining room, but it could be about people who are not finding, for example, vegetarian options or kosher options or other options. Jazakallah khair. And so anything that's going to address a certain need of humanity in general, whether it be a marginalized, disenfranchised group or set of individuals, I think we as Muslims should be utterly concerned about that. Even issues that we're talking about that are affecting the greater community, like climate change and preservation of resources and the finite resources that we have been blessed with in this world, in this environment. All of those things, to me, are inherently Islamic causes. In other words, as a Muslim, I should be concerned with them and not just concerned with what's going on in a particular Muslim country overseas, even though certainly that is within the realm of concern. But as a general principle, if we're going to be active about it, then the things that's within my purview that I actually have some influence over, that I can perhaps affect a change, are going to have a higher priority by the nature of the fact that I can do something about it, versus something that's going on 10,000 miles away. Perhaps I can do advocacy, awareness, and of course, we can always plead and implore with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is what everybody should be doing anyway, for their own cause, for their own needs, and also for the needs of others. So what I try to do, it's a huge topic. It's something that kind of needs, I think, a lot of work, and I'm trying to kind of put something together. So what I have here so far is kind of general ideas and trying to, I would say, somehow frame the conversation, if you will. And that's kind of the goal of what we're going to do with this particular seminar. And I also like to reiterate that when we have time for a question and answer, nothing's off the table. Ask whatever you like, even if it's a pointed question, even if it's a criticism, something that I said, that's fine too. No problem. I think we should refrain from just talking about people by name or something if we're going to talk in those lines, just to observe Islamic etiquette. But outside of that, everything is okay with me. Just try not to hurt my feelings too much. So when you criticize, just like keep it in perspective. You know? So when I tried to frame this, I thought about the idea of social justice, and in a minute I'm gonna get to about, well, where did that term come from to begin with, and is it something that's rooted within what we would say Islamic paradigm, and I'll talk about paradigms in a second. But when thinking about it, to me, we have some parallels within the Islamic tradition. The idea of al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, which is righting wrongs, enjoining good. And at the same time, we have a general frame of this idea of fulfilling of rights or honoring of rights, both of individuals and the particular roles that they may play in society or in families, as well as this greater idea of community rights, things that we owe to the community or the community has a responsibility to fulfill. And I think that's a little bit unique, I would say, in the Islamic understanding of things, because we will see, and I would posit that most of our understanding of rights today, in a particular environment that we're in, really goes back to individual rights. And individual rights in as much as they do not impose upon another individual right. And based upon that way of looking at things, we're going to see that that's going to have certain ramifications and consequences that as Muslims we should be weary and concerned with before we jump, head before heels into supporting a particular thing or cause. We should have to look at the big picture of everything. So, without further ado, there are many, many verses and hadith I could have picked that support this. You can say that there is a mutawatir ma'na, which is a unassailable, unequivocal meaning from Islam that justice is to be upheld and oppression is to be removed. And anyone who thinks differently doesn't understand Islam. Of course, there's definitions for justice, there's definitions for oppression. And there are methodologies in how we go about upholding justice and how we go about removing oppression, right? And one of those methodologies that we'll get to is in the course of upholding justice, you do not commit another injustice, or you do not use injustice to remove an injustice. So the means, the method, have to be sound and principled, just as the goals have to be sound and principled. So we don't have a Machiavellian kind of way of looking at things and the ends justifies the means. This ayah from Surah Al-Qasas, and we desire to show favor upon those who are oppressed in the earth and to make them leaders and to make them the inheritors. Similar to the biblical concept, and the meek shall inherit the earth. And so those who may be considered meek or weak in the eyes of communities and societies are not so in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's also going to be very important, that no matter what your particular position is in life and how people look at you, that is not indicative of how Allah looks at you. And that means also that we think about it, and it's important for us, well, how does Allah see us? How does Allah look at us? And then we do not become defined by other people's impression of ourselves or how they evaluate us, which, if you think about it, there's nothing more empowering than thinking about that, right? We seek validation and recognition from people on earth, different entities and institutions and members of society and so forth. But the ultimate validation and empowerment comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, comes from God. And no one can take that away from you. There's no one on earth who can say, well, you don't have that. Everybody has some share of that, depending upon their commitment to God, their commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which we'll see inshallah. And then the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, unsur akhaka zaliman aw mazluma. Help your brother whether he is the oppressor or the oppressed. The rest of that hadith, because on face value it looks problematic, taken at face value, taking a literal meaning without looking into the context. And even the companions proverbially scratched their head and asked the Prophet ﷺ, هذا المظلوم فما بال الظالم. We understand how to help the oppressed. That's like self-evident, intuitive. But how does one go about helping an oppressor? Do you actually help an oppressor? Right? And he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, تَكُفُّ عَنْ ظُلْمِهِ, to stop him from oppressing. أو تأخذ بيده على الظلم. Or in other words, to prevent him from oppressing. And here, this hadith also gives us some insight into the methodology of how oppression is to be removed, especially when we're dealing with fellow Muslims, or if we take this hadith to its linguistic sort of logical conclusion, here brother could be brother in humanity. So there is no justice except that there has to also be an underlying mercy about it. And so even though one may be considered an oppressor, that does not dehumanize them, and it does not remove them from the general family of humanity. And that's part of the methodology, because here the Prophet ﷺ said, unsur akhaka, your brother. So even though he's a zalim, right, even though he may be oppressing, and there's various degrees of dhulm, nevertheless, that doesn't mean they're no longer part of the greater community or society, right? It wouldn't be right to call them names, for example, that would dehumanize them. Oh, that guy's such a pig, or he's such a dog, or he's such a this, and so forth. Because what that does is you not only otherize them, you dehumanize them, and you kind of take them out of having any path to redemption. And you cut off that path to redemption. So you'll say once a harasser, once an oppressor, once a thief, once a this, then always a thief, then always a harasser, then always this. And our religion just doesn't really allow that. It gives a path back to redemption. The Prophet ﷺ talked about a serial killer, a serial murderer who killed 99 people in a previous community, not the community of the Prophet ﷺ, but someone that lived centuries before that. 99 people, right? In today's language, that would be, a terrorist, serial killer like the world has never seen. The Jeffrey Dahmers and Charles Mansons would have nothing, next to this guy. But yet, at the end of the hadith, he finds redemption. He sought it. He looked for it. And when he looked for it from the wrong person, someone who was an abid, right? The abid is the worshiper of God, the one who spends much time in remembrance of God. So he's instructed to go to him first. So he goes to him first, and he says, you've killed 99. How can you possibly have a path to redemption? Right? And the problem with the abid was not his ibadah, right? It was not his ritual acts of worship, but it was what he made them out to be for himself, such as that he could not imagine that someone else could reach what he reached without going through the same ritual acts of worship. Because he thought, well, how much longer is he going to live, and he's killed 99? How can he possibly be someone like me who is favored by God? And so there's also kind of an ishara or a signal that religious sanctimony, right, this sort of holier-than-thou piety that many of the outwardly religiously committed may fall into, this is what this particular man fell into. And he actually paid with his life. Because when he told them there's no redemption for you, he said, well, I'll just kill you too. So it became 100 people, right? So he made out 100 people now that he killed. But he was still remorseful, and he still wanted to find a path back. So then he was instructed to go to the alim, to the person of knowledge. In other words, the one who knows God, not just worships God, the one who knows God and knows that redemption is open for anybody. And you could have done 100 years in prostration, and someone else could have come and just had a moment of reevaluation of their life of redemption, and they are admitted into the mercy of God. And that takes nothing away from you, the one who's worshipped for a century, right? Nor does it take anything away from the person who found that redemption. It does not diminish him in any way. And that's the beauty of this path, that it's always open for anybody, right? And if you slip, as we all do, all of us eventually, or continuously will slip. But the important thing is coming back. So the knower of Allah said to him, you do have a path to redemption. But you need not to just merely rely on your willpower, which is another aspect of the methodology. Right? We don't just tell people stop doing that, and then we don't give them a plan. We don't give them a way by which they can stop doing that. You need to change the situation. So he changed the situation for him and told him, you need to go and leave and go somewhere else. This town that you're living in is not working for you, obviously, because you've killed 100 people in it. So it's time for you to make hijrah, to emigrate, to find a different place. And that's what he did. But on the way there, he dies. On the way to the new town. And so it's said that the angels then kind of disagreed about what to do with him. Someone said he hasn't done a single good thing in his life. He should go to hell. Others said, well, he's turned a leaf, he's turned a page, he's going somewhere else. So they disputed amongst themselves till it was settled that they would physically measure the distance. If he's closer to the new town, then he'd be a dweller of paradise. And if he's closer to the old town, then he'd be a dweller of hellfire. And he just made it over the halfway mark. So they admitted him to paradise. So we have a man in paradise right now, or at least in the barzakh paradise, that life in between death and the day of judgment, where it could be like a paradise or it could be like a hellfire, who's a serial killer, formerly was a serial killer. And he's not that anymore, which is another aspect of the methodology, namely that we don't use attached labels to people that are certain types of behavior, and then we make them permanent labels. And then you put them in a box, and then you can never take them out of that box. Oh, he's a racist. So he said a racist thing 30 years ago. Does that make him still a racist today? Is it not possible people can change? He was not a Muslim 30 years ago. He's a Muslim today, so he changed. Is that still to be held against them? Or is there a path to redemption? So justice always has to be tempered by mercy. And one of the reasons for that is justice in this life will always be inexact, will always be approximate, because it's based upon human understandings and human failings. And ultimately humans can only judge so well. The ultimate judge, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ultimate arbiter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So part of our notion of justice is that it's not just limited to this life, but also to the next life. And I'm getting ahead of myself because all these things come up later, but just to give you an idea of where we're going with this. So one of the things I think is important that, especially people who are involved in dawah, who are involved in social justice, who are involved in causes that seek to ameliorate or improve the lives of others, the context that we're all working in. And another word for context, when it takes on sort of a civilizational notion, is paradigm. So if you look it up in a dictionary, you might see something similar to what I wrote here, philosophical, theoretical framework that shape an individual's or community's presuppositions, objectives, morals, and life principles. So one of the tricky things about paradigm is you don't know you're actually in one unless you're subjected to a different one, right? People, for example, who may have lived in the West for a long time and then they go travel to a country that's in the East, whether the Far East or the Middle East, they may notice that somehow things are different. There's a different paradigm here. The way that people interact with each other, the way that how much personal space people give one another on the public transportation. And there's little indications here and there that it's not quite the same. You know, in other words, what people hold to be as higher objectives, as important, their assumptions about what are the most important things that should be fought for and so forth, those may differ from one paradigm to the next. And most of the world, especially the Western world, is dominated now by a type of paradigm that has its roots in the intellectual kind of stances taken by, civilizationally speaking, just about 200 or 300 years ago, not that long ago. And I think that's important for us to recognize that, if we agree with that, because it's going to inform what a lot of these words and terms that people throw around very easily, and I would say perhaps carelessly, without thinking about what are the implications behind those words, which I'll get to in a second. So if there is a such thing as a paradigm that informs our acts and our attitudes, is there a uniquely Islamic one, right? Or do we just assume that it somehow reconciles with whatever particular context that we're living in North America or in Europe or in Australia? Doesn't necessarily have to reconcile with that, or not? Or can it be at odds with it? And then the next question would be, well, then does it make a difference in our conceptualization of justice, whether you consider humans mere physical beings or consider them eternal souls? Because that's a paradigm issue. These secular societies, on a civilizational, institutional level, we human beings are no more than the physical sum of their parts. There's no concept of afterlife justice, right? That would be something constricted to, well, that's a matter of faith. But the way that the legal system works, the way that people go about their everyday business for the most part, does not assume that there's going to be an afterlife and that we are more than just this physical being, that there's a soul behind that. So is that going to make a difference in how we conceptualize justice or not? And I think it certainly does make a difference. There's one thing when you think this is it and there's nothing coming after this, right, versus this is just a very small kind of stop on the way, a very brief stop on the way to real life. And that this life is merely a proving grounds for that real life. If you believe that, then I think you're going to live your life differently, and your concept of what justice actually is going to differ as well. That's a paradigm issue. Another paradigm issue, when we talk about rights and what people are due, what individuals are due, what they deserve or what they have a right to, is that limited to individuals, or can the society or community have those rights as well? In other words, an individual has what we call a particular sanctity or inviolability about them, right? That they shouldn't be harmed. They should be free from harm. Everybody agrees about that. Can a community as a whole be free from harm? What about a concept? Should that be free from harm too? In other words, when we hold something that's a concept to be free from harm, we call that thing sacred, right? So is there a notion or a concept of the sacred in the paradigm that we have now? And what does sacred mean? It means it should be free from harm in the sense that it's inviolable. It should not be subject to a type of criticism that would be harmful. Just like an individual, there are certain types of we have libel and slander laws that it's considered harmful to the individual. Well, can you do libel or slander of a community? Or about, say, someone who lived in the past and not directly connected in a familiar nature to someone living in the present, so you're not ruining somebody's family name? So then we get into the whole subject of disparaging of prophets. Is that something that vibes, that kind of reconciles with this particular paradigm we live in? Or it doesn't reconcile? And I don't want to get into blasphemy laws and how they do it in Pakistan and all that type. That's a whole another thing, and the political ramifications of that. But what I'm talking about is the idea itself, right? There are some things that are held to be sacred or not to be sacred. So these are the questions I think we need to think about a little bit before we kind of jump into certain things and understand, well, can I piece together a constructive argument from the Islamic sources that the community has rights, or that there is a concept of the sacred, right? And if I have a concept of the sacred, then that's going to be a reference point for me, right, in terms of what I can challenge about what a particular scholar says, or what he doesn't say? And even beyond this, is there a concept of the absolute in the paradigm we're living now? Is there anything that's absolute? Or is everything relative? Is everything circumstantial? Or there are absolutes? This is just the way it is for all times and all places, forever. And even saying something like that makes most people in contemporary times uncomfortable. What do you mean absolute? All times, all places, no exceptions. No exceptions. Is there such a concept? Again, people would be hesitant to say, like, well, there always has to be some type of exception. How can it be any other way? But what I would argue is from the Islamic paradigm is that they're indeed absolutes. They're indeed immutable, unassailable, thawabit, things that don't change with time and place. The sanctity of the Quran, for example, that it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and has not been manipulated by anybody and never will be manipulated by anybody. That's an absolute for us. The absoluteness of everything that the Prophet ﷺ said is haqq, is true. That's an absolute for us, right? So we do have these absolutes. And so our understanding of reality then is defined by absolutes. It's not just subject to people's opinion, but there's a reality out there, and that reality can be known. Every aspect of reality, all the things about it? No. In fact, one of the absolutes is we can't even know everything about reality because we'll never be in a position to know everything about reality. But the paradigm we live in now, do they claim that eventually they know everything about reality and that nothing will be left to mystery or human imagination or human conjecture? Perhaps, right? You take an evolutionary theory class, you take even a biochemistry class, they might say that it's just a matter of time, right? We've uncovered the human genome, and it's just a matter of time before, we get to that promised land of the theory of everything that Stephen Hawking is looking for. Is that even possible? If we compare it with a particular Islamic, if we're going to piece together an Islamic paradigm. So these questions, I think, are pivotal, right? Because they ground us, and they kind of, once we have a grounding and we know, you can't get on the train and go from one destination to the next unless you know where the train station is to begin with, where your home train station is, and then you can set out where you're going to go on your journey and then where you're getting to. But if you're just on a train that's moving, you don't know where it came from, you don't know where it's going, all that you know, you're on a moving train, and so you move with it. How is that grounded? How can we actually go about and making positive and productive, effective changes to things that we see that are injustices when we don't know where the train began and we don't know where it's going, or at least a stated destination, an intended destination of where it's going? So, here are some words, and words have meanings, and these words are indicative of a particular historical narrative, right? There's a history behind each word and how it got to what it means today. And as I said, when we're on the train, we want to know where the train began, not just be on the moving train and just assume, because we can't get off of the train, that this is the way it has to be. Not necessarily. I think we should try to figure out what are some of these things and how do they come about. And that list is not exhaustive, but there are many things that we take for granted, right? Like the word development, bottom right corner. We take that for granted. So we have countries that need to develop, countries that are already developed, countries that are underdeveloped, and then we talk about this thing called the developed world and the undeveloped or the underdeveloped world. What does that mean? Who decides what development is? And what does it mean to develop? Because your country doesn't have 1/3 of the population on Facebook, it's underdeveloped? Or because it doesn't have a central banking system that is governed by the IMF and the World Bank, it's underdeveloped? Or maybe it doesn't have the electrical grid where electricity reaches every town and village. Does that make it underdeveloped? Or perhaps the roads are not all covered by asphalt. Does that make it underdeveloped? So it's what one German linguist called a plastic word, that it can just be used and manipulated in any way, right, for one's particular agenda or needs. This idea of development. The idea of progress. It's another one. What does progress mean? That is, if I had to pick one word that's indicative of the paradigm that we're kind of all subjected to, whether we choose to or not, it would be the word progress. It kind of epitomizes that, because it means that we are constantly on a better course to something better. So accompanying the technological progress, right? Nowadays, you can travel 1,000 miles and do it within a few hours, where 100 years ago or 200 years ago, you were talking weeks. That's progress, right? And here in 2017, I could send a message to someone literally halfway around the world within a nanosecond, and they can see that message. Whereas, I don't know, 20 years ago, that wasn't really possible, 30 years ago. So that means we've made progress. And so we're on this constant linear progression of progress. And that has also come to mean that particular social attitudes that were in the past, well, we've come to better social attitudes in the present. We've made progress. If we apply that to what we understand about our Islamic paradigm, we would have to say that, well, then the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the person that he was, that he lived in, how do we understand that from the notion of progress? Because we're saying that today, people's attitudes and morals and so forth may be better than they were during that time. And it also limits you. You can't make an argument like, well, that's how people used to do it, so maybe there's some truth to it. No, that would be an argument against you. You can't say it used to be done this way, or we used to think this way. Right? In the DSM, which is the psychiatric encyclopedia of disorders in the US, transgenderism is no longer a disorder. The new one. And the last one, the last iteration, it was a disorder. So can we say that progress has been made? And then I say, well, the old one said it was a disorder. But no, they weren't progressive. Now progress has been made, and now we understand it not to be a disorder. And then if you were to ask the question, well, why is it not a disorder anymore? What is the reason for that? What changed clinically, for example? Well, we've made progress. See what I'm getting at? So a lot of these words are being thrown around, right? Even progressive Islam, right? What does that mean? Does that mean we have made progress since the time before? But I thought Islam was about timeless principles, right? And I thought the Prophet ﷺ was sent to all people and all times. So how do we fit progress in with that? So it's a very problematic term when we're trying to ground it in, let's say, an Islamic epistemology, right? An Islamic way of knowing things. Even other words there, freedom, sexuality. Sexuality was not used as a word as we use it today, 100 years ago, 70, 80 years ago. Even the word heterosexual is not, it used to mean something quite different. It was a type of disorder, right? Someone who was kind of a sex addict or had a problem with that. Not that it meant someone who is attracted to someone, a member of the opposite sex. But that was a term that made progress, a term that evolved. Right? And now we even have this thing called cisgender. Anyone know who that is? What that is? How many people know what a cisgender is? Few of you, right? Because if you're not in, the cutting edge of where these terms are coming from, because if you have transgender, someone who's switching sex, either by intention or physically, from one to the other, then the cisgender is a person who's not doing that. So they're occupying the same gender, as it were, that they were born into. And then you might say, well, that just sounds like normal. Not anymore, because we've made progress. And so we need a word to describe what was heretofore understood as normal, right? But now we want to make a new normal where people can be transgender or they can be cisgender. وهكذا. Because that's part of the notion of progress. So you see where I'm getting at. We have to be aware of this particular paradigm that's going on. And the problem is we don't know our own paradigm. And I know we're out of time. I'm just going to spend like 3 minutes. We delayed a little bit, if that's okay with Sidi Osman. Here are some of the terms from our paradigm. Why did you write them in Arabic? Who's going to read them? Well, that's part of the problem, right? Because this particular paradigm is rooted in an understanding of where it came from. And the Arabic language is pivotal in that, right? Arabic language is not just the language of the Arabs, it's the language of Islam. People like Al-Ghazali and Al-Razi who were Persians, there's not their first language, but they made it their language, their working language, to flesh out these concepts. And so, someone who's working into translation, and I've done a little bit of it, it's very difficult when you're faced not just with the linguistic implications of it, but you're trying to translate between paradigms. So if I took a word like tawqifi, right, versus tawfiqi, that's an Islamic paradigm. What does that mean, tawqifi and tawfiqi? It almost sounds the same. There's only 2 letters have been switched around, but it's a paradigm. Tawqif means something that has been commanded to or designated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And tawfiqi is the dichotomy of that, the other flip side, which means it has become a human or social convention. It was agreed to by humanity. That's tawfiqi, min at-tawfiq. Amma at-tawqif, Allah has designated that. And so then when you read, for example, in Al-Itqan about Imam al-Suyuti, and he talks about the order of the chapters of the Quran. Is it tawqifi or tawfiqi? Right? Did the companions make their ijtihad and they put the orders of the chapters of the Quran? So then it would be tawfiqi. They arrived at a consensus. Or is it tawqifi? Did the Prophet ﷺ say, put this Baqarah first, and then Ali Imran after that, and then the Nisa after that? Then it would be something tawqif from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then if it's tawqif, it has different implications. Then that makes it from the unassailable. That makes it from the sacred, right? And then when we learn the majority of opinions are that it is from tawqif, then we look at the order of the chapters of the Quran as sacred, not just something determined by the Sahaba. And then if the order is sacred, then we begin to look for hikam. We look for wisdom. Why is the order of the Quran different than the chronological order of it? In other words, the way that it was revealed. And Allah doesn't do things in vain or abathan. So that means we look for the reasons. And so the Muslim scholars then started looking for reasons why Al-Baqarah came first and Al-Fatiha before that and Ali Imran and so forth. And then they looked for connections between the surahs. What's the connection of the end of Baqarah to the beginning of Ali Imran? Or the end of Al-Anfal to the beginning of At-Tawbah, Bara'ah, وهكذا. Right? It was built upon a particular paradigm. But to try to translate all that in another language, it's not just a language issue, it's an intellectual issue. And then we have many of those things that inform the Islamic paradigm. Al-Qat'i wal-Dhanni. Al-Qat'i wal-Dhanni. Qat'i means something that is unequivocal, right? Absolute. That's what Qat'i means. It means absolute. Amma Dhanni, it means not absolute. So when we say, for example, Al-Quran, جميعه قطعي الثبوت. The whole Quran is قطعي الثبوت. Every single verse in the Quran is absolute in terms of its veracity that it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's like a corollary. You can't go like khalas. If you have a problem with that, you have a problem with Islam. And then when we say al-hadith, أكثره ظني الثبوت. When we say the hadith, the prophetic traditions, we say most of it is ظني الثبوت, is not absolute in its veracity. That's why we have hadith classification system. We don't have a classification system for the ayahs of the Quran because they're all the same class. They're all the same category, absolute. But the hadith is not like that. The hadith, we have to look into the ruwat, we have to look into the narrators, we have to look into could they have actually met? Are they thiqat? Are they people who are trustworthy and are precise in their narration of hadith and so forth? Min tabaqa li tabaqa, from one level of narration to the next and so forth. So it's a very sophisticated system, all to establish the veracity, in other words, the truthfulness. Did the Prophet ﷺ actually say this or not say this, or do this or not do this? That's a paradigm. Then we have qat'i ad-dalala wa dhanni ad-dalala. It also applies into the meanings of the Quran and Hadith. Can this verse or Hadith mean only one thing? There's no other possibility for any other meaning? We call that qat'i. And we say, أكثر القرآن ليس قطعي الدلالة ولا الحديث. Most of the Quran and most of the Hadith is not like that, where there's only one possible understanding meaning. And then dhanni ad-dalala, it could have more than one meaning and understanding. And they don't have to be contradictory. They're not mutually exclusive. They can both work. So then that lends us to have this other paradigm called al-zahir wal-batin, which is an outward meaning and an inward meaning. And then something similar too, but not exactly the same, al-zahir wal-mu'awwal, the ostensible meaning and the interpreted meaning. And all of these things are applied to the nusus, right? They're applied to understanding the Quran and Sunnah, to informing our lives. وهكذا. So the Islamic paradigm is strong, it's sophisticated, it's rich, it's profound. And it takes a lot of effort, a considerable amount of effort to at least become familiarized with it, so that you can make it active, right? And that it informs the things that you do in your life, which include also social justice issues. So we're supposed to take a break here for Dhuhr, and we'll come back to this after the break, inshallah. Alhamdulillah.